The sun hammered down on the borderlands of the Arizona and New Mexico territories, a relentless blacksmith striking gold and copper sparks off the red rocks. It was the summer of 1874, and the heat did not care if a man was white, brown, or blue-coated cavalry. It simply burned. To the hawks circling high in the thermal currents, the land looked like a great, torn hide. Great gashes of crimson canyons scarred the earth, and the dry riverbeds twisted like old veins. But something new was cutting across the ancient skin of the desert, a long, black scar of iron and timber. The railroad. It smoked and screamed, a mechanical beast dragging cars full of silver ore and timber, shaking the ground where the Apache spirits were said to sleep. Dasan watched the train from a high ridge. He was a statue carved from mahogany and grief, blending so perfectly with the sandstone that a man could walk within 5 feet of him and see only rock. He wore the high moccasins of his people, silent on the stone, and a simple breechcloth. His chest was scarred, not just from battle, but from the sun dance of years past, before the world ended. He was a ghost in his own home. The people, the Apache, had been scattered like leaves in a gale. Some were herded onto the reservations, places where the water tasted of sulfur and the beef was rotten. Others were dead, their bones bleaching in the valleys where the cavalry had found them. Dasan belonged to neither group. He was the remnant. He lived by 2 laws now. First, he would never bend his knee to the white man. Second, he would not abandon the innocent who still walked these mountains, even if he was the only shield left between them and the abyss. Below him, the train chugged toward the town of Dustfall. Dasan spat on the ground. The iron snake drank the water and ate the wood. Soon, it would eat the mountain itself. Dustfall was a collection of clapboard buildings, and despair huddled together against the wind. It was a place where hope went to dry out and die. The main street was a river of fine, powdery dirt that coated everything in a beige film, the windows of the saloon, the weary horses at the hitching posts, and the black dress of Lila McKenna. Lila sat behind the heavy oak desk in the front office of the Briggs Rail and Mining Company. She was 24 years old, though the sun and the sorrow of the last 3 years had etched fine lines around her eyes that made her look older. She had hair the color of roasted coffee beans, pulled back tightly to keep it from the dust. But a few rebellious strands always escaped to frame a face that was more striking than pretty. It was a strong face, with a jaw that set firmly when she was angry, which was often these days. She dipped her pen into the inkwell and recorded another figure in the ledger. $200 for lumber, $50 for blasting powder. She hated this room. She hated the smell of stale cigar smoke that clung to the velvet curtains. She hated that she was here, serving the man who was slowly strangling her town, instead of teaching children to read or riding the range on her father's ranch. But the ranch was gone in all but name. Her father, Patrick McKenna, lay in the rocky cemetery on the hill. He had died 18 months ago in a dispute over water rights, a dispute that ended with a stray bullet from a dispute between company guards and rustlers. Everyone knew the guards worked for Colonel Silas Briggs. Everyone knew Patrick McKenna had been the loudest voice against the railroad expansion. Lila touched the side of her skirt, beneath the heavy fabric. Tucked into a hidden pocket she had sewn herself was a small, leather-bound notebook and the cold steel of her father's old Colt revolver. It was heavy, dragging down her hem, but the weight was the only thing that made her feel safe. The townspeople looked at her with a mix of pity and annoyance. To them, she was the stubborn McKenna girl, the one who refused to sell the last scrap of her father's land, the one who worked for the devil to pay off the devil's debts. The door to the inner office opened, and the devil walked out. Colonel Silas Briggs was a large man, taking up space not just with his girth, but with his sheer, overwhelming presence. He wore a suit of fine gray wool that seemed impervious to the heat, and his face was hidden behind a thick, gray beard that smelled of bay rum and ambition. "Miss McKenna," Briggs said. His voice was deep, a rumble that sounded like rocks tumbling in a mine shaft. "Have the letters to the War Department been drafted?" Lila did not look up immediately. She finished writing the date July 4th, 1874, and blotted the ink carefully. "They are on your desk, Colonel, along with the surveyor's report you asked for." Briggs walked to the window, looking out at the dusty street where a group of miners were arguing with a shopkeeper. "Good. We need those soldiers. The investors in the East are getting jittery. They hear stories about wild Apaches raiding the supply lines. Bad for business. Lila? Very bad." Lila stiffened. "There have been no raids in 3 months. Colonel, just hungry people stealing cattle to survive." Briggs turned, his eyes cold and hard as flint. "A thief is a thief, my dear, and a savage is a savage. Civilization requires order, and order requires a heavy hand." He walked over to her desk, placing a heavy hand on the ledger, too close to her own. "Speaking of order, have you reconsidered my offer on the homestead? The company needs that creek bed. We can pay you enough to move east. St. Louis, perhaps. A pretty woman like you could find a husband there. A teacher, maybe someone soft." Lila pulled her hand back, her spine straightening. "My father is buried on that land. Colonel, I am not selling his grave, so you can wash your ore." Briggs chuckled, a dry sound. "Sentiment. It is a luxury, Miss McKenna, one you can barely afford." He turned back to his office. "Bring me the map from the safe, the new one, the survey of the southern pass." Lila stood up. Her legs felt stiff. She walked to the large iron safe in the corner. Briggs had given her the combination weeks ago. An act of arrogance rather than trust. He believed she was too broken to be a threat. She spun the dial left to 40, right to 10, left to 25. The heavy door groaned open. Inside, stacks of cash and gold certificates sat ignored. Lila reached for the rolled parchment tube Briggs had requested, but as she pulled it out, another map underneath shifted. It was hand-drawn, older, marked with red ink. Lila paused. Her eyes scanned the red markings. They did not follow the flat plains. They cut straight through the jagged teeth of the mountains. Her finger hovered over a specific location marked with a skull and crossed sabers. Throat Canyon. It was a narrow, treacherous pass that the locals avoided. The Apache called it a sacred place, the breath of the earth. The map showed a line drawn right through it, blocking the exit. And scribbled in the margin in Briggs's handwriting were the words, "Close the throat, starve the body." "Miss McKenna," Briggs's voice came from the doorway, sharp with suspicion. Lila grabbed the requested map and slammed the safe door shut, hiding the red-inked horror. She turned, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Here it is. Colonel." Briggs stared at her for a long moment. He took the map. "You look pale. Lila, the heat is getting to you." "Just a headache," she lied. "Go home early," Briggs said, dismissing her with a wave. "Tomorrow's a big day. The supply convoy arrives. We will need to inventory everything, every bullet." He walked back into his office and closed the door. Lila stood there, trembling. Close the throat. He wasn't just building a railroad. He was planning to seal off the water sources and the hunting grounds. He was planning to trap the remaining Apache in the high desert and let thirst do the work of bullets. Out in the street, the sun was beginning to dip toward the western horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and blood orange. Lila walked toward the livery stable where she kept her mare. The boardwalk rattled under her boots. Her boots, they were fine leather. Once, but her feet had swollen in the heat, and the leather had shrunk from repeated wetting and drying. The laces dug into her instep, binding her feet so tightly it was a dull, throbbing ache with every step. She wanted to stop and loosen them, but she wouldn't give the town the satisfaction of seeing her weakness. She kept walking, the pain a constant reminder of her situation. She was bound, constricted, forced into a shape that didn't fit her anymore. A group of men were gathered outside the saloon, bounty hunters. They wore long dusters and carried rifles that looked too well oiled. They weren't miners. They were here for blood money. "Look at that," one of them sneered, spitting tobacco juice near Lila's hem. "That's the schoolmarm working for the colonel, high and mighty. Ain't she?" Just another woman waiting for a man to tell her what to do. Another laughed. Lila gripped her bag tighter. She could feel the outline of the Colt against her hip. She kept her eyes forward, but her ears caught every word. "Colonel says there's $50 a head for any buck found south of the canyon," the first man said, lowering his voice. "Easy money. They're starving and weak." Lila reached the edge of town. She didn't go to the stable immediately. She stopped by the water trough, leaning against the rough wood. The wind was picking up, carrying grit from the north. She looked west, somewhere out there. Hidden in the labyrinth of stone and shadow were the people Briggs wanted to erase. She didn't know them. Her father had taught her to be wary of them, but he had also taught her that a man who fights for his home is worthy of respect. Briggs was fighting for profit. The Apache were fighting for existence, and she was in the middle, taking the colonel's silver to buy hay for a horse she rarely had time to ride. "I am sorry, Papa," she whispered to the wind. "I do not know how to stop him." Miles away, on a promontory that jutted out over the valley like the prow of a ship, Dasan watched the lights of dustfall flicker into existence as the twilight deepened. He had seen the new men arrive, the ones with the eyes of wolves and the smell of old blood. He had seen the wagons loaded with crates that bore the stamp of the U.S. Army. He reached into the pouch at his waist and pulled out a small stone, carved into the shape of a bear. It belonged to his brother, who had died trying to protect the women when the blue coats burned the winter camp. Dasan's grip on the stone tightened until his knuckles were white. The wind whipped his black hair across his face, but he did not blink. He saw the flag flying above the largest building in the town, the company headquarters. It snapped and cracked in the wind. To Dasan, it did not look like a symbol of a nation. It looked like a shroud. The spirits of the mountain were restless tonight. He could feel the vibration in the soles of his feet. A storm was coming. Not a storm of rain and thunder, for the sky was clear. This was a storm of iron and lead. He looked toward Throat Canyon, the dark gash in the distance. It was the only way to the secret springs, the only way his people could survive the summer without coming down into the valley where the guns waited. "They will come for the throat," Dasan said, his voice rough and low, speaking the language of his ancestors to the empty air. "Let them come." He turned from the cliff edge. He would not sleep tonight. He would check the traps. He would sharpen his knife. He would wait, back in the town. Lila McKenna stood at the edge of the desert, the sunset reflecting in her eyes. She looked down at her boots, the laces cutting into her skin, marking her flesh with red, angry lines. She felt trapped, but as she looked up at the darkening mountains, a strange, terrifying thought took root in her mind. If she could not untie the knots that bound her, perhaps she would have to cut them. She touched the pistol in her pocket one last time, then turned and walked back into the gathering dark, while high above, the lone warrior faded into the night. Two sparks destined to ignite a fire that would burn the borderlands down to the bone. The morning sun did not bring light to Lila McKenna. It brought a summons. The dust in the air inside the Briggs Rail and Mining Company office was thick enough to taste, swirling in the shafts of light that pierced the heavy velvet curtains. Colonel Silas Briggs sat behind his mahogany desk, the very picture of industrial composure, but his eyes were hard, like two chips of flint buried in a riverbed. He did not shout about the map she had seen the day before. He did not threaten to fire her. That would have been too simple for a man who played chess with mountains and rivers. "Curiosity is a dangerous virtue in a woman, Miss McKenna," Briggs said, smoothing a crease in his gray wool coat. "But perhaps it can be put to use." Lila stood before him, her hands clasped tightly to stop them from trembling. She could feel the weight of the hidden Colt revolver against her hip. A cold comfort. "I was merely organizing the safe, Colonel, as I was paid to do." "Of course," Briggs said. He slid a thick leather satchel across the polished wood. It was heavy, sealed with wax and the company's stamp. "Since you have such an interest in the geography of the Southern Pass, you will deliver this dispatch to the outpost near Throat Canyon. Lieutenant Harrow is expecting these orders." Lila stared at the bag. Throat Canyon was 20 miles of bad road through the country that God had seemingly abandoned to scorpions and ghosts. "I am a clerk, colonel, not a courier. Send one of your riders?" "My riders are needed here," Briggs replied, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a rumble that vibrated in Lila's chest. "And besides, a woman in a carriage is less likely to draw the attention of the Apache remnants than a patrol of armed men. They will think you are merely a settler's wife visiting a husband." "I refuse," Lila said, turning to leave. "If you deliver this," Briggs said, his words stopping her hand on the doorknob, "I will sign the deed to your father's homestead over to you, free and clear. The debt will be erased. You will own the water, the grass, and the bones in the ground." Lila froze. It was the only thing in the world she wanted. It was the only thing keeping her tethered to this dying town. She turned back, looking at the man who had ordered the fences that got her father killed. She saw the lie in his eyes, but she also saw the desperation of her own life reflecting back at her. She had no money. She had no allies. She only had her pride, and pride was a poor blanket against the cold. "I want it in writing," she said, her voice steady. "The promise of the deed." Briggs smiled, a thin stretching of lips that did not reach his eyes. "Deliver the bag, Lila, then we will write history together." The journey began at noon, under a sun that bleached the color from the world. Lila sat in the back of a small, open buckboard wagon. Two of Briggs's private guards rode on horseback ahead, men with faces like saddle leather and eyes that watched the horizon with bored malice. The driver was a man named Miller, who spat tobacco juice every 50 yards and smelled of old sweat. Lila clutched the leather satchel to her chest. She could feel the stiff parchment through the leather. She knew, deep down, that she was carrying death. These were not just letters. They were the coordinates for the slaughter Briggs had planned. She was buying her father's land with the blood of the people who had lived there for 1,000 years. The guilt tasted like ash in her mouth. They entered the foothills 3 hours later. The road narrowed, winding between towering spires of red sandstone that looked like the fingers of a buried giant clawing at the sky. The air grew still. The birds stopped singing. The attack did not begin with a war cry. It began with a crack that echoed off the canyon walls. The guard on the left slumped forward, a red flower blooming on his duster. Then the chaos erupted. Gunfire erupted from the rocks above, a thunderous rolling sound that terrified the horses. The buckboard swerved violently as Miller took a bullet to the shoulder and dropped the reins. "Get down!" one of the guards screamed before his horse reared and threw him. Lila did not get down. Instinct, sharp and bright, seized her. The wagon was tipping. Men in rags, white men with masked faces, outlaws. Not Apache, were scrambling down the scree slopes. They were shouting about gold, about the payroll. They thought this was a supply run. Lila grabbed the satchel and the canteen at her feet as the wagon crashed onto its side, splintering wood sending dust into the air. She rolled into the scrub brush. Pain flared in her shoulder, but she ignored it. She scrambled to her feet, staying low, using the chaotic cloud of dust as cover. She did not run back toward the road. She ran toward the dark, jagged maw of a side canyon, a narrow fissure in the rock face that looked too small for a horse. She heard shouting behind her. "The girl, she has the bag. Get her!" Lila ran. Her boots, the ones that had tortured her in town, now slipped on loose shale. She gasped for air, her lungs burning. She scrambled over boulders and pushed through dry, thorny mesquite that tore at her dress. She squeezed into the fissure, the rock walls rising up on either side like the walls of a tomb, blocking out the sun. She ran until the sounds of gunfire faded, replaced by the heavy thudding of her own heart. The canyon floor here was shadowed and cool, a maze of fallen rocks and deep crevices. She slowed down, looking for a place to hide, a place to rest. The ground was uneven, covered in patches of shadow. She saw a gap between two large boulders, a perfect spot to wedge herself in and wait for nightfall. She stepped forward, her left foot landing on what she thought was a pile of loose dirt. Clang! The sound was not loud, but it was mechanical, precise and final. The ground seemed to bite her. Two curved bars of cold iron snapped up from the dirt. They did not clamp shut on her ankle like a bear trap. Instead, they struck the outside of her thighs, just above the knee, and locked with a ratcheting screech. The force threw her forward, but the chains anchored to the rock held her back. She screamed, a sound that was torn from her throat before she could stop it. The pain was immediate and blinding. The iron bars were spring-loaded to push outward, to spread. They forced her legs apart, stretching the muscles and tendons to their limit, and then locked in place. Lila fell onto her back, the breath knocked out of her. She tried to bring her legs together, to close them against the agonizing pressure, but the machine would not yield. The iron dug into her flesh, bruising the bone. She was pinned, splayed open on the canyon floor, trapped in a device that was cruel in its geometry. She reached down, her hands frantic, tearing at her skirts. She saw the mechanism. It was not a trap for catching food. It was a trap for breaking things. Stamped into the base plate of the iron, visible even in the gloom, was a symbol, a hammer and a pickaxe crossed, the Briggs Rail and Mining Company. She was caught in a trap made by the man she served. Night fell like a heavy wool blanket, suffocating and cold. The desert temperature plummeted, stealing the warmth from Lila's body. She had spent hours pulling at the chains, digging at the rocky soil with her fingernails until they bled, but the anchor was driven deep into the stone. Every time she tried to move, to relieve the strain on her hips and thighs, the iron teeth bit deeper. The skin on her outer thighs was raw and bleeding. Her muscles spasmed in agonizing cramps, screaming for relief that she could not give them. She was exhausted, thirsty, and terrified. The wind moaned through the canyon, sounding like the voices of the dead. But then, beneath the wind, she heard something else, the crunch of a soft sole on gravel. Lila stiffened. The outlaws, or worse, a mountain lion. She fumbled for the pocket of her dress, her fingers numb with cold. She found the handle of her father's Colt. It felt incredibly heavy. She pulled it out, her hand shaking so badly the barrel wavered in the air. "Stay back," she croaked. Her voice was a dry rasp. "I will shoot." A shadow detached itself from the canyon wall. It was tall, silent, and human. It moved with a grace that no white man possessed. The figure stepped into a patch of moonlight. It was him, the warrior she had seen watching the town, Dasan. He stood 10 feet away, holding a rifle that looked old but well cared for. His long black hair moved in the wind. He looked at her, then at the trap, his face an unreadable mask of stone. Lila tried to aim the gun. She tried to be the brave daughter of Patrick McKenna, but the pain in her legs was a roaring fire that consumed her will. Her arm trembled violently. The heavy revolver slipped from her sweat-slicked fingers and clattered onto the stones. She sobbed, a sound of pure defeat. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with shame and agony. She tried to pull her skirt down to cover herself, but the iron bars held her legs wide, exposing her in a way that felt like a violation of her very soul. She stammered, the tears cutting tracks through the dust on her face. "I cannot close my legs. It hurts. I cannot move." Dasan did not speak. He stepped closer, lowering his rifle. He looked down at the metal that bound her. He saw the design. He had seen this before, used on wild mustangs to break their spirit, to keep them from running so they could be branded. But this was modified. The teeth were sharper. The spring was stronger. It was a Briggs special, a device sewn into the earth to cripple anything that tried to use the old Apache paths. He looked at the woman. She was the enemy. She was one of the swarms that were devouring the land. She worked for the man whose mark was stamped on the iron. If he left her here, the coyotes and the cold would finish her by morning. It would be one less mouth eating the food of his people. His law was clear: protect the people. Trust no white face. But he looked at her eyes. They were not the eyes of a predator. They were the eyes of a trapped fawn. He saw the blood on her hands where she had tried to free herself. He saw the defiance that had kept her from screaming until she could scream no more. Dasan remembered his sister, who had died in the snow because no one came for her. He cursed softly in his own tongue. He could not leave her. To leave her to this torture would make him no better than the man who built the trap. He knelt beside her. Lila flinched, gasping, squeezing her eyes shut as if expecting a blow. "Do not fight the iron," Dasan said. His voice was low, rough like gravel, but his English was clear. "Breathe." Lila opened her eyes. He was close, so close she could see the faint scar running down his cheekbone. He was not looking at her with lust or malice. He was looking at the trap with the focused intensity of a surgeon. It is stuck," she whispered. "It is designed to hold," Dasan said. He pulled a heavy knife from his belt. It was not steel, but obsidian, black and sharp as a razor. "To open it, I must press the spring. It will hurt. If you move, the bone will break." He reached out. His hands were large and calloused. He placed one hand on the iron bar pressing against her left thigh, and the other on the locking mechanism. "Ready?" he asked. He did not wait for an answer. He pushed. The metal groaned. The pressure on her leg increased for a blinding second. Digging into the wound, Lila cried out, arching her back, her fingers clawing into the dirt. "Breathe," Dasan commanded. "Look at me. Do not look at the leg. Look at me." Lila locked eyes with him. His eyes were dark, infinite pools of calm in her world of pain. She focused on them. She breathed, a jagged, sobbing breath. With a sharp click, the ratchet was released. Dasan shoved the bar outward, fighting the spring, and jammed a wedge of rock into the mechanism to keep it open. He did the same to the other side. "Now," he said. "Pull." Lila tried to pull her legs free, but her muscles were jelly. She could not move. Dasan moved instantly. He did not ask. He slid his arm under her knees and his other arm behind her back. He lifted her. For a moment, as he pulled her free of the iron jaws, her body collapsed against his. Her legs, finally released from the unnatural stretch, shook uncontrollably. She fell against his chest, her face pressing into the rough buckskin of his vest. She expected to smell filth. She expected the smell of the savage she had been warned about. Instead, she smelled wood smoke. She smelled sagebrush and old leather. She smelled the sharp, salty scent of honest sweat. It was the smell of the earth, primal and clean. It was the safest thing she had smelled in years. Dasan held her. He did not fondle her. He did not take advantage of her helplessness. He held her as one would hold a wounded child, creating a rigid frame with his own body to support hers. "Can you stand?" he asked. Lila tried to put weight on her feet. Her legs buckled immediately. The tendons in her inner thighs felt torn. She gasped, gripping his arms to keep from hitting the ground. "No," she said, shame burning her cheeks. "I am sorry, I cannot." Dasan looked at the darkening sky. The wind was getting colder. He looked at the trap, now sitting empty like a hungry mouth denied its meal. Then his eyes fell on the leather satchel she had dropped. He stooped, keeping a supporting arm around her waist, and picked it up. He felt the heavy paper inside. He knew the seal of the government. "This is why you ran," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," Lila said. "My father's land." Briggs said. "Briggs," Dasan spat the name. "This bag is poisonous. It is death for my people. I should burn it." He made a move as if to throw it into the darkness. But Lila grabbed his wrist. Her grip was weak, but her desperation gave it strength. "No," she pleaded. "It is the only proof I have. If I lose this, I lose everything. My home, my father's grave. Please." Dasan looked at her hand on his wrist, her pale, trembling fingers against his dark skin. Two enemies, bound by a common hatred of one man, yet divided by a river of blood. "Your home is already gone," Dasan said. "Briggs has eaten it." "Then I will cut it out of his stomach," Lila said. Her voice wavered, but the steel was there. Dasan studied her face. He saw the fire in her. It was a small flame, flickering in the wind. But it was there. He respected fire. He secured the bag over his shoulder. He did not burn it, but he did not give it back to her. "We cannot stay here," he said. "The wolves act as scouts for the men who hunt. They will smell the blood." "I have a horse," Lila said, though she knew the wagon was miles back. The road is for the dead," Dasan said. "We go up." He shifted his grip and swept her up into his arms, carrying her as easily as if she were a bundle of dry grass. Lila wrapped her arms around his neck, not out of affection, but out of necessity. His body was hard, warm, and alive. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, looking at the towering walls of the canyon that seemed to close in on them. Dasan began to walk, finding a path in the darkness that her eyes could not see. He moved toward the deeper, wilder heart of the mountains, toward the places that were not on any map in Briggs's safe. "If I leave you," Dasan said, his voice echoing slightly off the stone walls, "wolves will eat your fear before your flesh. You are in my world now, white woman." Lila rested her head against his shoulder, exhausted beyond measure. She watched the trap disappear into the shadows behind them. The iron had let her go, but as Dasan carried her into the black unknown, she knew that something else had taken hold of her. She had crossed a line. There would be no going back to the ledger and the inkwell. The wind howled, signaling the start of the long, cold night. Dasan did not look back. He climbed. The climb had been a blur of pain and vertigo, a nightmare ascending into the stars. When they finally stopped, the world did not stop spinning for Lila McKenna. She felt herself being lowered onto something soft, not the hard, unforgiving ground of the canyon, but furs, thick, coarse, warm furs. She blinked, her eyes gritty with sand and exhaustion. She expected a dark hole, a damp lair where a beast might drag its kill. That was the story the women in Dustfall whispered to one another while buying flour. The Apache lived in dirt. They lived like wolves. But the firelight dancing on the stone walls revealed something else entirely. They were in a high alcove, a natural scoop in the mountain face, protected by an overhang of limestone. It was dry. It was clean. The floor had been swept clear of debris. In the corner, a stack of firewood was piled with geometric precision. Bunches of dried herbs, sage, yarrow, and others she could not name hung from the ceiling, filling the air with a scent that was sharp and medicinal, masking the copper smell of her own blood. There were no skulls. There were no scalps. On a small ledge carved into the rock, she saw a single eagle feather, a pouch of leather, and a small, smooth stone painted with a jagged blue line. It was an altar, a place of reverence. Lila tried to sit up, but a fresh wave of agony radiated from her thighs. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a sob. Dasan was already moving. He had built the fire up from embers to a steady, smokeless flame. He moved with an economy of motion that mesmerized her. He did not stomp or blunder. He flowed. He poured water from a skin bag into a small iron pot and set it near the flames. "You are safe here," he said. He did not look at her. He was busy crushing dried leaves between two stones. The wind carries the scent away. The rock hides the light. "My legs," Lila whispered. The shame returned, hot and prickling, competing with the pain. "The bleeding." The iron was rusty, Dasan said. He turned to her then, holding a wooden bowl filled with a dark, green paste. The steam rising from it smelled of earth and bitterness. "If we do not clean it, the fever will take your leg, and then it will take your life." He knelt beside the pile of furs. His face was severe, illuminated by the firelight, casting deep shadows in the hollows of his cheeks. He reached for the hem of her tattered dress. Lila flinched, her hands shooting down to cover herself. The memory of the trap, the exposure, the violation of being splayed open for the world to see, was still raw. "Do not look," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Please." Dasan paused. His hand hovered in the air, open, palm up. He did not pull her hands away. He did not force her. He met her gaze, his dark eyes devoid of the lecherous hunger she had seen in the men at the saloon, devoid of the possessive arrogance of Colonel Briggs. "I look only at the iron they put in you," he said. His voice was flat, carrying the weight of a professional duty. I see the wound, not the woman. Slowly, Lila's fingers loosened. She nodded, turning her face toward the stone wall, biting her lip until she tasted iron. Dasan worked quickly. He used a piece of clean doe skin dipped in warm water to wash the dried blood and grit from the torn flesh of her inner thighs. The water stung, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. He did not scrub. He dabbed. When he applied the green poultice, the burning sensation flared white-hot for a second, then settled into a deep, numbing cool. He bound her legs with strips of soft cloth he had taken from a storage bundle. He worked with the efficiency of a man who had dressed many wounds too many wounds. "Drink," he said, lifting her head and pressing a cup of willow bark tea to her lips. "It is bitter, but it will dull the teeth of the pain." Lila drank. It tasted like mud and old wood, but she swallowed it down. She watched him as he moved back to the fire to clean his hands. He was a paradox. The town called him a savage, a remnant of a violent past. Yet, here he was, in a home that was cleaner than the boarding house she lived in, tending to the daughter of his enemy with hands that could kill but chose to heal. "Why?" she asked. The question hung in the silence of the cave. Dasan sat cross-legged by the fire, sharpening his obsidian knife on a whetstone. The rhythmic shh sound was hypnotic. "Why what? Why did you bring me here? You could have left me. You hate us. You hate what we are doing." Dasan stopped sharpening. He looked at the entrance of the cave, where he had hung a series of small bones and hollow reeds. They were silent now, but Lila realized they were an alarm system, designed to sing out if anyone disturbed the air at the trailhead. "You are not the railroad," Dasan said. "You are not the cavalry." "I work for them," Lila countered, her guilt forcing the confession. "I write the letters. I keep the ledger. I am part of the machine. A trapped wolf chews off its own leg to survive," Dasan said, looking back at her. "You did not chew. You let the iron hold you because you thought you had no choice. Tonight, I saw you hold a gun. You did not fire, but you held it. That is why." He stood up and walked to the entrance, checking the placement of a large rock he had rolled across the lower path. "And because your enemy poisons the same water my people drink. If the river dies, the Apache dies. If the river dies, the rancher dies. The poison does not care about the color of the skin." Lila closed her eyes. The willow bark was working. The sharp edges of the world were softening. But her mind drifted back to the leather satchel. It lay near the fire where Dasan had dropped it. "The bag," she murmured. "The papers." Dasan picked up the satchel. He undid the buckle. Lila expected him to use the paper for kindling. Instead, he pulled out the thick sheaf of documents. He unfolded the map she had seen in the safe. And then he unfolded the letter signed by the War Department. He held the paper to the firelight. His eyes scanned the lines, moving left to right. Lila pushed herself up on her elbows, ignoring the protest of her muscles. You can read." Dasan did not look up. "Your Colonel Briggs is not the only man who knows the value of ink. I went to the mission school when I was a boy, before the soldiers burned it. They taught me to read the Bible. They taught me that God is love. And then they beat us when we spoke our own tongue." He lowered the paper. His expression was terrifying in its stillness. "This is not a survey," he said. "This is a slaughter order." "I know," Lila said. "He wants to close the canyon. He wants to cut off the water. It says here," Dasan tapped the paper with a callous finger, "that any Apache found south of the Throat Canyon is to be considered hostile and terminated. It says the land is uninhabited. It says the water rights belong to the Briggs Rail and Mining Company in perpetuity." He looked at Lila. "He is selling land that has people standing on it. He plans to knock the people down so the land is flat for his tracks." "We can stop him," Lila said, a feverish intensity entering her voice. She reached out a hand. "Give me the papers. If I can get them to Santa Fe, to the territorial judge, or send them east to the newspapers. New York, Boston. People there do not know. If they see his signature, if they see he is using the army for private gain, they will stop him." Dasan laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, like a branch snapping in winter. You think paper will stop a bullet? You think a judge in Santa Fe cares about dead Apache? There are laws, Lila insisted. We are a nation of laws. Your law is his knife, Dasan said, tossing the papers back onto the satchel. He wrote the law. He pays the judge. He owns the ink. You want to fight him with the weapon he gave you. You will lose. Then what is the answer? Lila cried out, frustration bringing tears to her eyes. Killing him. If you kill him, 10 more will take his place. They will call you a murderer and send an entire regiment to wipe you out. Better to die on your feet with a gun in your hand than to die on your knees waiting for a judge to read a paper, Dasan said. The argument died in the air as the wind outside suddenly shrieked. The temperature in the cave dropped 10 degrees in a second. A storm was hitting the mountain. The wind howled like a banshee, driving sand and grit against the stone face. The leather flap Dasan had hung over the entrance billowed violently, letting in gusts of freezing air. Lila shivered. The cold was sudden and brutal, but inside her, a different heat was rising. The trauma of the injury, the loss of blood, and the stress of the escape had triggered the body's defense. Cold, she whispered. Her teeth began to chatter. So cold. Dasan moved instantly. He secured the entrance flap with heavy stones, sealing them in. Then he came to her. He touched her forehead. His hand felt like ice against her burning skin. The fever is here, he said. The rest of the night was a delirium of shadows and fire. Lila drifted in and out of consciousness. One moment she was back in the schoolhouse, teaching children the alphabet. The next she was in the canyon, the iron teeth biting into her legs. She cried out, thrashing in the furs. Shh, a voice said. A firm hand pressed against her shoulder, holding her down, keeping her safe. I am here. The iron is gone. Dasan did not sleep. He sat beside her, a guardian statue. He refreshed the cool cloth on her forehead every hour. He lifted her head to give her water when the wind shook the mountain, causing dust to drift down from the ceiling. He leaned over her, shielding her face with his own body. Lila opened her eyes in the deepest part of the night. The fire was low. She saw Dasan's profile. He looked exhausted. His eyes were heavy, but he forced them open, watching the entrance, watching her chest rise and fall. He was a warrior, a killer, according to the town, but his hands were gentle. He had touched her only to heal, never to take. Dasan, she whispered. He looked down. Sleep. The storm is breaking. You are tired. I will sleep when the winter comes, he said softly. Rest now. Lila closed her eyes, and for the first time in 3 years, since her father died, she felt completely protected. It was a strange, confusing feeling. She was supposed to hate him. She was supposed to fear him. But as she drifted back into sleep, the smell of sage and wood smoke felt more like home than the sterile, dusty room she rented in town. Morning brought a silence so profound it rang in the ears. The wind had died. The sun sliced through the gap in the entrance flap, a beam of pure, dust-mote-filled gold. Lila woke slowly. The fever had broken. Her head felt light, cleared of the fog, though her body ached with a deep, heavy fatigue. Her legs throbbed, but it was a healing pain, not the sharp agony of infection. She turned her head. Dasan was asleep. He was sitting with his back against the stone wall near the entrance. His legs stretched out. His chin rested on his chest. Even in sleep, his right hand rested on the stock of the rifle across his lap. Lila watched him. In the daylight, he looked younger. The lines of tension around his mouth had smoothed out. She saw the wear on his moccasins, the careful stitching on his vest. He was a man who lived on the edge of extinction, holding on with fingernails and grit. She felt a tightening in her chest that had nothing to do with the fever. It was gratitude. Yes, but it was something else. It was an acknowledgement of shared humanity. He had stood between her and the dark all night. She tried to sit up, the rustle of the furs loud in the quiet cave. Dasan's eyes snapped open. There was no grogginess, no moment of confusion. He was awake and alert in a heartbeat, His eyes darted to the entrance, then to her. "The fever?" he asked, his voice rasping with morning dryness. "Gone," Lila said. She pushed herself up to a sitting position, wincing slightly. "I feel weak, but clear." Dasan nodded. He stood and stretched, his spine cracking audibly. He walked to the entrance and pushed aside the leather flap. He stepped out onto the ledge, scanning the valley below. Lila watched his back. She saw him stiffen. He stood there for a long minute, motionless as the rock itself. Then he turned back, his face grim. "Can you ride?" he asked. I think so," Lila said. "Why?" "Look," he gestured. Lila dragged herself to her feet, leaning heavily on the wall for support. She hobbled to the entrance. The bright light hurt her eyes, but she looked where he pointed, far down in the valley, to the south. A column of thin, black smoke rose into the still air. It was rhythmic. Puff, puff, pause, puff. "Apache," she asked if hope was rising. "No," Dasan said. "Apache smoke is white, sage and pine. That is oil smoke, black and heavy." Then a sound drifted up on the thermal currents, a low, rolling thrum. Drums, but not the erratic, spirited rhythm of a tribal dance. This was a steady, monotonous beat. Thumb, thumb, thumb. "The army uses drums to signal the march," Dasan said. "And the smoke, that is a signal from the scouts Briggs hired, the Navajo scouts who sold their souls." He turned to Lila. "They have found the wagon. They have found the tracks. They know you did not die in the trap." "They are coming for me," Lila said, fear clutching her throat. "They are coming for the savage who kidnapped the white woman," Dasan corrected. "Briggs has spun a story. He will paint himself as the hero coming to rescue you from the monster. If they find us here, they will kill me and drag you back to sign those papers." He moved past her, beginning to pack the few items in the cave. He rolled the furs. He took the pouch of herbs. He kicked dirt over the fire. "We cannot stay," he said. "This place is burned." "Where can we go?" Lila asked. "If they have scouts, they will find us in the open." Dasan slung the rifle over his shoulder. He looked at her, and for the first time, he seemed to weigh her not as a burden, but as a partner. "There is one place," he said. "A place not on the map in the satchel. A place where the old ones still sing." He handed her the satchel. The weight of it was familiar now. "Take the papers," he said. "You want to fight with the law first. You must live. We go to the hidden camp. We go to my people." Lila took the bag. She looked at the man who had saved her, then down at the valley where the black smoke rose like a finger of accusation. She realized she was leaving behind everything she knew: the town, the rules, the safety of being a white woman in a white man's world. "I am ready," she said. Dasan nodded. He offered her his arm to help her walk to where the horses were hidden. "Then walk," he said. "The storm is over. The war begins." The map in the leather satchel said the land was empty. It was a blank parchment of cream and ink, marked only with the proposed lines of the railroad and the jagged scrawl of property claims. But as Lila McKenna rode deeper into the wilderness behind Dasan, she realized the map was a lie. The land was not empty. It was a library written in stone. Dasan had lifted her onto his horse, a roan mare with intelligent eyes and a gait as smooth as flowing water. He walked beside her, his hand resting lightly on the mare's flank, guiding them through a labyrinth of red rock and sage. "Lean with the beast," Dasan instructed, his voice low. "Do not fight the motion. If you fight, the muscle tears. If you flow, the pain sleeps." Lila gripped the pommel, gritting her teeth. The bandages on her thighs were tight, but the rhythm of the horse still sent dull shocks of pain through her injuries. Yet, as she focused on his words, she began to see what he saw. They passed a towering cliff face where etched figures of deer and men danced in the sunlight. Dasan touched his forehead as they passed, a silent gesture of respect. They crossed a stream that ran clear over multicolored pebbles, where a pile of stones marked a crossing used for generations. "My father called this wasteland," Lila said, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Men cannot see what they wish to destroy. Dasan replied. If they saw the spirits here, they would have to put down their rifles. It is easier to be blind. They had been riding for 4 hours when the silence of the canyon was shattered. It was not a gunshot, but the clatter of shod hooves on stone, a sound too loud, too careless to be Apache. Dasan froze. He signaled the mare to stop with a single touch, then motioned for Lila to stay low. He melted into the shadow of a large boulder, becoming invisible. Below them, on the narrow trail they had avoided, a group of 5 riders appeared. They wore long dusters and wide-brimmed hats. Sunlight glinted off the brass of their repeating rifles. Bounty hunters. "Tracks are fresh here," one man shouted. His voice was gravelly and cruel. "That buck and the girl came this way. $50 says she is already dead." Another laughed. "Savage probably ate her." Lila felt a surge of nausea. These were men she might have served coffee to in the town diner. Now, hearing them speak, she realized they were more animals than the man hiding in the rocks beside her. She watched Dasan. He did not reach for his rifle to kill. Instead, he moved silently up the scree slope, his moccasins making no sound greater than a shifting lizard. He reached a precarious shelf of rock where a pile of loose shale balanced. With a precise, calculated shove, he dislodged a single keystone. The mountain roared. A cascade of rocks, dust, and debris thundered down into the canyon, landing just ahead of the riders. It was not enough to bury them, but it was enough to terrify the horses. The animals reared, screaming, throwing 2 of the men to the ground. The others fought to control their mounts, their rifles firing blindly into the dust cloud. "Ambush!" one screamed. "Pull back! Pull back!" In the confusion, Dasan slipped back to the mare. He grabbed the bridle and led Lila away. Not running, but moving swiftly into a narrow fissure in the rock wall that the bounty hunters would never spot in their panic. Lila looked back. The men were cursing, nursing bruises, but they were alive. "You could have shot them," she said, her heart hammering against her ribs. They were sitting ducks. Dasan did not look back. A wolf kills to eat or to protect the pack. Only a mad dog kills because he can. If I kill them, their brothers come with more hate. If I scare them, they remember the mountain has teeth. Lila stared at his back. She felt a fracture in her soul, a cracking of the foundation she had stood on all her life. She had wanted to call out to the white men. For a split second, instinct had told her they were her rescuers. But looking at their greed and Dasan's mercy, she realized she had been wrong. The color of skin did not determine the savage. The heart did. She remembered Colonel Briggs ordering his men to beat her father when he refused to sign the first deed. She remembered the silence of the town sheriff. "My people," she whispered to the wind. "They are not my people anymore." Night found them in a high basin, sheltered by a ring of ancient pines. The air was thin and sharp, biting at Lila's exposed skin. Dasan built a small fire in a pit he dug deep into the earth, keeping the flames low to hide the light. They ate dried venison and hardtack Lila had in the satchel. The food was dry and tough, but hunger made it taste like a feast. Lila sat close to the fire, the heat soothing the ache in her legs. Dasan sat opposite her, cleaning his rifle. "Where is your family?" she asked. The question had been burning in her throat all day. "The others," Dasan paused, the rag still on the gun barrel. "The wind took them. My wife, my son. They were at the winter camp when the blue coats came. It was dawn. They were sleeping." He did not elaborate, but the hollowness in his voice carved a picture more terrible than any words. "I am sorry," Lila said. The words felt small, useless. "And your father?" Dasan asked, his eyes lifting to meet hers. "The man who owned the land Briggs wants." "He was a good man," Lila said, staring into the embers. "But he was stubborn. He thought a piece of paper from the government meant he owned the earth. He didn't understand that Briggs owned the government. They raised his taxes. They blocked his water. They sued him for fences he didn't build. They killed him with paper before they shot him with lead." Dasan nodded slowly. "The paper death. It is slow, like a snake that squeezes. We are not so different." Lila realized aloud. We are both just obstacles in the path of the train. The train does not care, Dasan said. It only eats. The wind picked up, whistling through the pine needles. Lila shivered violently. Her dress was torn, and the shock of the injury left her unable to hold her body heat. She wrapped her arms around herself, her teeth chattering. Dasan stood up. He walked over to her, carrying the thick buffalo robe he used for a bedroll. He did not toss it to her. He sat down beside her, draping the heavy fur over her shoulders, pulling it tight. The night has teeth, he said. He was close. Lila could smell him wood smoke, pine resin, and the musk of a man who lived in the wild. It was not an unpleasant smell. It was grounding. My leg, she gasped as a cramp seized her injured thigh. It is seizing up. Turn, Dasan commanded gently. Lean against me. Lila hesitated for only a second before shifting her weight. She leaned back against his chest. He adjusted the robe around them both, creating a cocoon of warmth. His arm came around her, not to hold her captive, but to rest his hand on her thigh, just above the bandage. I must check the heat, he said, to see if the poison returns. His hand was warm and large. Through the fabric of her dress, she could feel the calluses on his palm. He did not caress. He pressed firmly, checking the muscle, checking the temperature of the skin. Lila's breath hitched. It was the most intimate contact she had ever experienced. It was not the clumsy, grabbing hands of the drunkards in town. It was the touch of a protector. She felt his heart beating against her back, a steady, slow rhythm that calmed her own racing pulse. It is cool, he murmured near her ear. The wound sleeps. He did not move his hand away. He left it there, a heavy, reassuring weight. Lila relaxed against him, her head falling back onto his shoulder. In the darkness, surrounded by enemies, with her name likely on a wanted poster in dustfall, she felt a strange, terrifying peace. Dasan, she whispered. Sleep, he said. I will watch. The next day brought them to the place Dasan had been seeking. They rode through a narrow slot canyon that opened up into a hidden valley, a bowl of green grass and water that was invisible from the plains. But as they entered, Lila's heart sank. She had expected a fortress. She saw a ruin. Half the teepees were charred skeletons, their wooden poles pointing at the sky like blackened fingers. The smell of old smoke hung in the air. There were no warriors practicing with lances. There were only a few dozen people, mostly women, children, and old men with gray braids. They looked up as Dasan rode in. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow with the 1,000-yard stare of survivors who had seen too much. This is the danger Briggs fears? Lila asked, her voice trembling with indignation. These are the hostiles. To Briggs, a child who breathes is hostile, Dasan said, dismounting. He helped Lila down. Her legs were stiff, but she could stand. An old woman emerged from the largest of the remaining tents. She was small, her face a map of wrinkles so deep they looked like the canyons they had just ridden through. She leaned on a twisted staff adorned with owl feathers. This was the medicine woman. She looked at Dasan, then at Lila. Her eyes narrowed. She spat a phrase in Apache that sounded sharp and accusatory. She asks why I bring the Deathbringer into the sanctuary. Dasan translated, his face impassive. Tell her, Lila said, standing as tall as her pain would allow. Tell her I brought the truth. Dasan spoke to the woman in their tongue. He gestured to the satchel. He gestured to Lila's bandaged legs. He spoke softly, but with authority. The old woman stepped closer. She peered into Lila's face. She reached out a bony hand and touched the bruise on Lila's cheek. She looked at the bandages visible through the torn skirt. She carries their lies, Dasan said to the woman in English, so Lila could understand. And our chance? The old woman grunted. She did not smile, but she stepped back, gesturing for them to enter the camp. Children began to creep out from behind their mothers' skirts. They did not throw stones. They stared with wide, dark eyes. A little girl, no older than 6, walked up to Lila. She touched the fabric of Lila's dress. fascinated by the buttons. Lila looked down at the child. She had the same eyes as the students Lila had taught in the town schoolhouse. Innocent, curious. "Hello," Lila whispered. The girl giggled and ran back to her mother. Lila felt a tear slide down her dust-caked cheek. These were the people her letters had helped to target. These were the obstacles. That evening, a council was held around the central fire. It was a small circle. Dasan, the medicine woman, and a scarred warrior named Ka, who had lost an eye and carried a hatred that radiated off him like heat from a stove. Lila sat with them, the leather satchel in her lap. "We must strike," Ka argued, slamming his fist into his palm. "We take these papers. We go to Briggs's house. We burn it. We kill him in his bed." "If you kill him," Lila said, her voice shaking but gaining strength, "the army will burn this valley before the sun sets. They will say you are murderers. They will hunt down every child here." Ka sneered at her. "And what does the white woman offer? Words?" Lila opened the satchel. She pulled out the map and the contract. "This is proof of conspiracy. Briggs is using army resources for private profit. That is a federal crime. If I can get this to the territorial judge in Santa Fe or to the newspapers in the East, they will freeze his assets. They will launch an investigation." "Paper," Ka spat. "Paper is weak. Paper built the railroad," Lila countered. "Paper sent the army. Paper killed my father. You cannot fight the train with arrows. Ka, you have to derail it. And this," she held up the contract, "is the crowbar." Dasan watched her. He saw the transformation. The terrified girl in the trap was gone. In her place was a woman who was learning to wield her own kind of weapon. "She is right," Dasan said. The circle fell silent. "We cannot win a war of blood. We are too few, but we can make them bleed where they are weak. We can make them bleed gold." "Justice," Lila said firmly. "Not revenge. Justice is a white man's word," the medicine woman croaked. "But survival is ours." Just then, a young boy ran into the circle. He was breathless, his chest heaving. He spoke rapidly to Dasan. Dasan's face hardened. He looked at Lila, then at Ka. "The time for debate is over," Dasan said. "The scout says Briggs is on the move. He's not waiting for the army. He has gathered his private guards and the workers. They are moving toward Throat Canyon. He is coming to close the pass," Lila realized with horror. "He wants to seal us in." "He brings dynamite," the boy added in broken English. Dasan stood up. The firelight cast his shadow long and tall against the rocks. "He wants to close the throat," Dasan said. "Then we will make him choke on it." He turned to Lila. "You want to use your paper. You will get your chance. But first, we must stop the iron." Lila stood up beside him. The pain in her legs was forgotten. "I am going with you. It will be dangerous," Dasan said. "I know the map," Lila said. "I know where he plans to set the charges, and I know Silas Briggs. He is arrogant. He will not look at the rocks. He will look at the prize." Dasan looked at her, a fierce pride burning in his eyes. "Then we ride," he said. "Tonight, the wolf and the fawn hunt together." The decision was made. They would not run. They would return to Throat Canyon, the place of the trap, and turn it into a grave for the company's ambition. Throat Canyon lived up to its name. It was a narrow, jagged constriction in the earth, a place where the wind sounded like a gasping breath and the red walls rose high enough to blot out the midday sun. It was a choke point, a kill box. Dasan moved along the high ridge with the silence of a cloud shadow. He checked the ropes made of braided yucca and rawhide. They held back tons of loose shale and boulders, balanced precariously on the lip of the canyon. Below, the floor of the pass was shadowed and cool, deceptive in its tranquility. "The trap is set," Ka whispered, crouching beside him. The scarred warrior's one good eye burned with anticipation. "We should kill them all when they enter. Leave no white skin to tell the tale." "No," Dasan said, his voice hard. "We kill the snake. The rest will scatter if the head is cut off. If we slaughter them all, the army will not stop until every Apache baby is dead. We follow the woman's plan." Ka spat on the ground but nodded. He signaled to the other warriors hidden in the crevices of the rock face. They melted into the stone, invisible. Down on the canyon floor, Lila McKenna stood alone. She wore her torn dress, the hem ragged and stained with dust. Her hair was loose, wilder than it had ever been in the schoolhouse. She stood near the center of the trail, her hands bound loosely with a piece of leather that she could shed in a second. She was the bait. She forced her breathing to slow. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could hear them coming, the creak of leather harnesses, the jingle of bits, the heavy, arrogant tread of iron-shod hooves. The procession rounded the bend. Colonel Silas Briggs rode at the front on a massive black gelding. He looked like a king inspecting his domain. He wore a crisp linen duster and a hat that cost more than most men in Dustfall earned in a year. Flanking him were 6 of his hired gunsmen with cold eyes and hands hovering over their holsters. Behind them came a platoon of blue-coated soldiers, looking weary and dusty, and a group of town laborers carrying pickaxes and crates of dynamite. Briggs pulled his horse to a halt when he saw her. A slow, satisfied smile spread across his face beneath his gray beard. "Well, well," Briggs boomed, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "I was told the savages had you, but it looks like they abandoned their prize." He gestured to one of his men. "Go get her. She looks used up, but she still holds the deed." Lila did not flinch. She did not cower. She watched the hired gun ride closer, then looked past him, locking eyes with Briggs. "I am not a prize, Silas," she said. Her voice was not loud, but the canyon acoustics carried it to every man in the column. "And I was not abandoned." Briggs laughed. "You are delirious, my dear. The heat has boiled your brain. Come now." "Give me the satchel. I see it there on the ground. Sign the papers. We can end this farce." "The farce ends today," Lila said. She shrugged her shoulders. The leather binding fell from her wrists. In one fluid motion, she snatched the leather satchel from the dirt and pulled out the sheaf of documents. "Dasan!" she shouted. From the shadows of the cliff, Dasan stepped into view. He stood high on a rock shelf, his rifle held easily in his hands. He did not aim for it. He just stood there, a sentinel of the mountain. The soldiers leveled their carbines instantly. The hired guns drew their revolvers. "Hold fire," Briggs commanded, though his face flushed with anger. "The girl is in the line." He looked up at Dasan. "One Indian, you think one buck scares me?" "He is not alone," Lila said. "And neither am I." She unfolded the contract. She held it up. "Soldiers of the 5th Cavalry Workers of Dustfall. Do you know what you are marching for today?" "Shut her up," Briggs hissed to his lieutenant. "No!" Lila raised her voice. "Listen to me. Colonel Briggs has a contract with the War Department that declares this canyon uninhabited hostile territory. But look." She pointed to the cliffs. On the ridges, the Apache warriors revealed themselves, not with weapons raised, but simply standing, and behind them, looking small and terrified, but present, were the witnesses the Apache scouts had guided through the back trails during the night: a local pastor, holding his Bible; the town baker, a journalist from Santa Fe who had been passing through. "He is not clearing hostiles," Lila read from the paper. "Article 4, Section 2. All water rights and mineral deposits within the clearance zone revert immediately to the private holding of Briggs Rail and Mining. He is using the United States Army as his private demolition crew to steal the water that feeds your farms." A murmur rippled through the ranks of the soldiers. A young corporal lowered his rifle. "Sir, is that true? My uncle farms down in the valley. If they dam this water—" "She is lying," Briggs roared. He pulled his own heavy revolver. "She has gone native. She is sleeping with the enemy sergeant. Shoot that Indian, shoot him now." "The contract is signed by you, Colonel," Lila shouted. "And it authorizes collateral damage to the town if necessary to secure the rail line. You are not protecting Dustfall. You are selling it." The laborers behind the soldiers began to back away. They dropped their pickaxes. They knew Lila. She had taught their children. "I ain't killing folks for a damn," one of the workers shouted. Briggs's face turned a violent shade of purple. The mask of the benevolent businessman shattered, revealing the tyrant underneath. I gave you an order, Briggs screamed at the soldiers. Kill them! Kill them all! The lieutenant hesitated. Sir, those are civilians up there. The pastor. I said fire. Briggs turned his gun toward Lila. The shot cracked through the air. It missed Lila by inches, kicking up dust at her feet. Now, Dasan shouted from the ridge. He did not fire at the soldiers. He fired at the rope. High above, the knots gave way. A rumble like the end of the world shook the ground. Tons of rock poured down the canyon walls behind Briggs's column, sealing the entrance, cutting off their retreat. Panic erupted. The horses reared, screaming. The dust cloud swallowed the rear of the column. Kill the savage, Briggs shrieked, pointing up at Dasan. The hired guns did not hesitate. They opened fire on the ridge. Bullets chipped the stone around Dasan. He returned fire, methodical and calm, aiming not for the men, but for the rocks near their feet, driving them to cover. Lila, run! Dasan yelled. Lila scrambled toward the side of the canyon, seeking the cover of a large fallen slab. Briggs saw her moving. Get her, he ordered his lead gunman, a man with a scar across his nose. She does not leave this canyon alive. The gunman spurred his horse, charging through the chaos toward Lila. He raised his Winchester. Dasan saw the threat. He abandoned his cover, leaping from the high shelf to a lower outcropping to get a clear shot. He fired, hitting the dirt in front of the gunman's horse, but the man kept coming. Dasan leveled his rifle again, but a bullet from below, fired by another mercenary, caught him. He jerked back violently, his rifle spinning from his hand. Blood sprayed from his shoulder. He collapsed onto the ledge, exposed. Dasan! Lila screamed. The gunman with the scar grinned. He pulled his horse to a halt 10 feet from Lila, but his eyes were on the wounded Apache above. He raised his rifle, aiming for Dasan's chest. Good night, Chief, the gunman sneered. Lila looked around wildly. Her father's old Colt was in the satchel, but the satchel was 5 feet away in the open. She didn't think so. She didn't calculate. She dove. Her hand closed around the heavy grip of the revolver inside the bag. She rolled onto her back, the dust stinging her eyes. The gunman heard the movement and started to turn his weapon toward her, but he was too slow. Lila held the gun with 2 hands. She did not close her eyes. She did not look away. She remembered the target practice behind the barn with her father. Squeeze, don't pull. She fired. The recoil jarred her arms to the shoulder. The bullet did not hit the gunman's heart. She was not a killer, but it smashed into his forearm, shattering the bone. The man screamed, dropping his rifle. He clutched his ruined arm, his horse shying away. Lila scrambled up, pumped the lever of the revolver to chamber another round, and pointed it at him. Get back, she yelled. Get back, or the next one is between your eyes. The gunman fled. Lila did not wait. She holstered the gun and climbed the jagged rocks up to the lower ledge where Dasan lay. He was pale, his teeth gritted against the pain. The bullet had torn through the muscle of his left shoulder. Blood was soaking his buckskin vest, dark and slick. You, Dasan gasped, looking at her with wide, shocked eyes. You shot him. I missed his head, Lila said, her voice trembling now that the action was over. She tore a strip from her petticoat, the white fabric stark against the red blood. Press this here, she commanded, her hands moving with the swift assurance of someone who had bound scraped knees and cut fingers for years, though this was far worse. Hard! Dasan groaned, his head lolling back against the stone. His breathing was shallow and rapid. The shock was setting in. Dasan! Look at me, Lila said, leaning over him. She grabbed his face with her blood-stained hands, forcing him to focus. Do not go to sleep. Look at me. He blinked, struggling to fix his gaze on her. The iron, he muttered, his mind drifting back to the trap. No iron, Lila said fiercely. Just flesh. Breathe with me, Dasan. Like you told me, breathe. She inhaled deeply, exaggerating the motion. Dasan watched her. He mimicked her, taking a ragged, hitching breath. Good, she whispered. tying the bandage tight. Again! Below them, the battle had shifted. The soldiers had stopped firing. They were taking cover, but they were not returning fire at the Apache. The lieutenant was shouting orders to cease fire. The pastor was standing on a rock, waving his Bible, screaming for peace. Briggs was alone in the center of the canyon, his horse pacing nervously. His hired guns were either wounded or pinned down by the superior positioning of Ka and his warriors. "Traitors!" Briggs screamed at the soldiers. "I pay your wages, fight. We are paid by the United States Army, sir," the lieutenant shouted back from behind a boulder. "And I will not fire on non-combatants. Put down your weapon." "I am the law here," Briggs roared. "Not anymore," a voice echoed from the ledge. Lila stood up. She helped Hassan to his feet. He leaned heavily on her, his good arm around her waist. But he stood. Together. They looked down at the man who had tormented them both. Lila held up the satchel again. "It is over. Silas," she called down. "The pastor has seen the papers. The journalist has seen them. The soldiers know. You are done." Briggs looked around. He saw the soldiers pointing their rifles not at the cliffs, but at him. He saw the workers watching him with disgust. He saw the Apache warriors, silent and waiting. Arrows knocked. He was cornered. The Emperor of Dust had no clothes. A madness took his eyes. He looked at the blocked entrance behind him, then at the narrow, twisting path that led deeper into the canyon, the path to the sacred springs, the path he had rigged with dynamite to seal off the water. "You think you have won?" Briggs snarled. "If I cannot have this land, no one will." He spurred his horse, not toward the exit, but toward the plunger box for the dynamite charges that sat near the canyon wall. 200 yards deeper in. "He is going to blow the springs," Dasan rasped, trying to raise his arm, but he was too weak. "Stop him," the lieutenant shouted. Soldiers fired, but Briggs was moving fast, low over his horse's neck. Briggs reached the plunger box. He leaped from his horse, his face twisted in a rictus of hate. He grabbed the handle. "I will bury you all!" he screamed. He pushed the plunger down. Nothing happened. The dynamite did not explode. The canyon remained silent. Briggs stared at the box in confusion. He pulled it up and slammed it down again. Click. Nothing. High on the cliff above the box. Ka stepped out. He held a bundle of cut wires in his hand. He dropped them. They fluttered down like dead snakes, landing at Briggs's feet. Briggs looked up, horror dawning on his face. He had forgotten the first rule of the mountain: the land has eyes. Then a sound came from above. Not an explosion, but a crack. The vibration of Briggs' horse, the shouting, and the earlier gunfire had loosened the unstable rock formation directly above him, the very formation he had intended to collapse with the dynamite. Briggs looked up, just as the shadow fell over him. A slab of sandstone, the size of a carriage, detached itself from the wall. He opened his mouth to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the earth. The rock crashed down with a force that shook the canyon floor. Dust billowed up in a choking gray cloud, obscuring everything. When the dust settled, there was no plunger box. There was no Silas Briggs. There was only a new pile of rubble, indistinguishable from the thousands of other rocks in the canyon. He had wanted to close the throat of the canyon. Instead, the canyon had swallowed him whole. Silence descended. It was heavy and absolute. The soldiers lowered their rifles. The hired guns threw their revolvers into the dirt, raising their hands in surrender. On the ledge, Lila felt Dasan's weight increase as his adrenaline faded. He slumped against her. "He is gone," Lila whispered, looking at the stone tomb. "The mountain took its payment," Dasan murmured. His eyes were closing. Lila sat him down gently on the stone. Her hands were sticky with his blood. Her dress was ruined. Her life in Dustfall was over. She looked at the soldiers, who were now moving to arrest the mercenaries. She looked at the pastor, who was kneeling in prayer. Then she looked at the Apache warriors, who were slowly descending the cliffs, not as conquerors, but as ghosts returning to flesh. She touched Dasan's face, leaving a streak of red on his cheek. "Rest now," she said, echoing the words he had said to her in the cave. "The war is over." But as she looked at the rising sun illuminating the red walls of Throat Canyon, she knew it wasn't just an end. It was the beginning. The iron trap was broken, not just on her legs, but on the land itself. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with air that finally, for the first time in years, tasted free. The silence that followed the collapse of the canyon wall was heavier than the granite that had buried Silas Briggs. It was a silence that demanded reverence, not just for the dead, but for the sudden, violent shifting of the world. The dust took 3 hours to settle. By the time the air was clear enough to breathe without coughing, the sun was dipping low, painting the red rocks in shades of bruised purple. Lila McKenna stood near the entrance of Throat Canyon. Her hands were still stained with Dasan's blood. Though the bleeding had stopped, he lay on a stretcher made of 2 rifles and a blanket, unconscious, his breath shallow but steady. Around them, the survivors of the battle moved like sleepwalkers. There was no cheering. Victory in the high desert did not taste like wine. It tasted of ash and copper. The digging began before the moon rose. It was a strange, unprecedented sight. On the soft earth near the riverbed, 2 groups of men worked side by side. One group wore the dusty blue wool of the United States Cavalry, their uniforms torn and sweat-stained. The other group wore buckskin and cloth, their skin painted with the symbols of war and mourning. They did not speak to one another. They did not share water skins, but they dug in the same rhythm. Thud, scrape, toss. Lila watched as they laid the bodies into the earth. There were mercenaries who had died for money they would never spend. There were young soldiers who had died following orders they did not understand. And there were Apache warriors who had died defending a home that was shrinking every day. "Where do we put them?" a young corporal asked, wiping grime from his forehead. He looked at the Apache bodies, then at his fallen comrades. Separate plots the colonel would have wanted. "The colonel is under the mountain," Lila said, her voice cutting through the evening air. She limped forward, her bandaged legs stiff and aching. "And the earth does not care about the color of the uniform. They died on the same ground. Let them sleep in it together." The lieutenant, a man named Holloway, who looked 10 years older than he had that morning, nodded slowly. "She is right. Dig the line straight." And so, the graves were marked in a single row. Some had wooden crosses hastily lashed together. Others had piles of stones arranged in the 4 cardinal directions. It was a cemetery of enemies united by the finality of death. As the last prayer was spoken, a mix of the Lord's Prayer and a low, chanting song from the Apache elder, Lila felt a hand on her arm. It was the medicine woman. She did not look at the graves. She looked at Lila, then pointed to the stretcher where Dasan lay. "The spirit wanders," the old woman said in broken English. "We must call it back before the owl takes it." The days that followed were a blur of heat and herbs. They did not return to the hidden camp high in the mountains. Dasan was too weak to move that far. Instead, they set up a temporary settlement near the mouth of the canyon, using the tents left behind by Briggs's fleeing workers. Lila did not leave Dasan's side. The bullet had shattered his clavicle and torn through the heavy muscle of his shoulder. Infection was the true enemy now, the silent killer that stalked every wound in the territory. Lila found herself in a reversal of roles that felt like destiny closing a circle. Weeks ago, she had lain in a cave, delirious with pain, while Dasan cooled her forehead and fought the poison in her legs. Now, she was the watcher. She learned quickly. The medicine woman, whose name Lila learned was Goya, was a strict teacher. She showed Lila which roots to boil to break a fever, and which moss could soak up the pus from a wound. "Not too hot," Goya scolded, smacking Lila's hand lightly as she prepared a poultice. "You cook the skin, not heal the blood. Gentle." Lila nodded, wiping sweat from her eyes. "Gentle," she repeated. She spent hours wringing out cool clothes to place on Dasan's burning chest. She cleaned the wound with the meticulous care of a jeweler, flinching every time he groaned in his unconscious state, in the quiet hours of the night, when the camp was asleep, and only the coyotes sang to the moon. Lila talked to him. "You cannot leave," she whispered, tracing the line of his jaw with a trembling finger. "You told me the wolves would eat my fear. Well, I am not afraid anymore, but I am not ready to be alone." She looked at her own legs, where the scars from the iron trap were turning from angry red to a dull pink. They were ugly marks, jagged lines that would never fully fade, but they were strong. She could stand. She could walk. "You saved me from the iron," she told the sleeping man. "Now you must save yourself from the dark." On the fourth day, the fever broke. Lila was dozing in a chair she had dragged from a supply wagon, her head resting on the edge of Dasan's cot. She felt a movement. A hand, weak and calloused, brushed against her hair. She shot up, her heart pounding. Dasan was looking at her. His eyes were clear, the glassy sheen of infection gone. He looked exhausted, his face gaunt, but he was there. "You are loud when you sleep," he rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves. Lila let out a laugh that was half a sob. She grabbed his hand, pressing it to her cheek. "And you are lazy, sleeping for 4 days while I do all the work." Dasan's lips curved into a faint smile. "I was dreaming," he said softly. "I dreamt of a trap, but the iron had no teeth. And the bait was a woman who held a gun like a warrior." "Rest," Lila said, her throat tight. "You have a lot of healing to do." "We both do," Dasan replied, his eyes drifting to the scars on her legs visible beneath her skirt. While Dasan healed, the world outside the canyon was shifting. The documents Lila had retrieved from the satchel had done their work. She had entrusted them to the journalist from Santa Fe, a man named Sterling who had witnessed the rockfall. He had ridden out the hour the dust settled, carrying the story of the century. 2 weeks later, a federal marshal arrived in Dustfall. The impact was slow but crushing. The Briggs Rail and Mining Company was placed under immediate investigation. The accounts were frozen. The War Department, eager to distance itself from a rogue colonel who had died in disgrace, issued a frantic order halting all expansion into the territory pending a review of the treaties. The railroad stopped. The Iron Snake had been beheaded, but the social wounds were harder to stitch than flesh. Lila rode into Dustfall one afternoon to buy supplies. The town was different. The fear that had hung over it like a storm cloud was gone, replaced by a sullen confusion. Some people, the saloon owner, the men who had profited from Briggs's coin, spat on the ground when she passed. They called her a traitor. They whispered that she was an Indian lover who had turned on her own race. But others stopped her. Mrs. Higgins, the baker's wife, ran out into the street with a loaf of warm bread. "For the journey." "Lila," she said, pressing the bread into Lila's hands. Her eyes were wet. "My boy, he was in the militia. He told me what happened. He said you stood in front of the guns. He said the colonel was going to blow the water." "He was," Lila said gently. "Then you saved us." Mrs. Higgins said, "We did not know. Lila, we thought we were the good ones." It was a small victory, but it was enough. Later that day, Lila was loading her pack horse when a man approached. He wore civilian clothes, a rough shirt, and denim trousers, but he stood with the posture of a soldier. It was the young corporal. "Thomas, Miss McKenna," he said, taking off his hat. "Corporal," Lila acknowledged. "Not anymore, ma'am," he said, looking at his boots. "I resigned my commission. I could not wear the blue after what I saw in that canyon." "What will you do?" Lila asked. "I am good with horses," Thomas said. "The livery stable needs a hand. It is honest work, and I want to be here, to make sure the graves are kept, both sides." Lila smiled. It was the first time she had smiled in the town since her father died. "That is a good thing, Thomas." The dead appreciate the company. By the time the aspen leaves began to turn gold, signaling the approach of autumn, Throat Canyon had transformed. It was no longer a choke point. It had become a door. The Apache, wary but practical, began to bring their goods to the canyon entrance. They brought tanned buckskin, soft as velvet. They brought dried venison, baskets woven from river reeds, and turquoise stones. The townspeople, driven by curiosity and need, came to meet them. They brought sacks of flour, steel knives, coffee, and bolts of colored cloth. Lila sat on a large flat rock near the entrance, watching the exchange. She saw Ka, the one-eyed warrior, haggling with the town blacksmith over the price of a hatchet. They did not speak the same language, but they spoke the language of hands and numbers, and eventually they nodded. Ka walked away with a sharp blade, and the blacksmith walked away with a stack of beaver pelts. "It is strange," Dasan said, walking up beside her. He still favored his left shoulder, and his arm was in a sling, but he walked with his old strength. "They trade with the people they wanted to kill a moon ago. Hunger has no politics," Lila said, "and neither does profit. But it is a start. They are looking at each other. That is harder to do when you are looking down a gun barrel." "You built this," Dasan said. He sat beside her, close enough that their arms touched. "We built this," Lila corrected. "You broke the trap. I just opened the door." Dasan looked at her. The afternoon sun caught the lights in his dark eyes. "The door is open for you too. Lila, you can go through it. You can go back to the town. You can buy your father's land back now. The debt is gone." Lila looked at the town in the distance, then at the canyon behind her. She looked at the scars on her legs, hidden beneath her skirt but etched into her memory. "I do not know if I fit in that box anymore," she said. The test of her resolve came 3 days later in the form of a man named Mr. Alistair Finch. He arrived in a private carriage, a man of soft hands and expensive suits, smelling of lavender water and city smoke. He was a publisher from Boston. He found Lila near the campfire, writing in her journal. "Miss McKenna," Finch said, extending a hand. "It is an honor. Truly. The story of the Angel of the Canyon has reached the East Coast. It is sensational." Lila stood up, ignoring his hand. "I am not an angel, Mr. Finch, and this was not a sensation. It was a war." Of course," Finch said dismissively. "But the readers, they love the romance of it, the tragedy, a refined woman captured by the wild, saving the savages from themselves." Lila stiffened. "I saved the savages, they saved me." Finch waved his hand. "Details, my dear, we can smooth those out. Listen to me. I am here to offer you a contract. Come to Boston. We will write your memoirs. You will be the toast of society. Lectures, book tours. You can leave this." He gestured vaguely at the red rocks and the dust. "This desolate place. You can have civilization, hot baths, silk dresses, safety." He placed a contract on the rock. It promised $5,000. A fortune, enough to live like a queen for the rest of her life. "Think about it," Finch said. "I leave tomorrow at noon. Do not throw away your future for a patch of dirt." That night, the wind blew cold through the canyon. Lila sat by the fire, the contract in her hand. Dasan emerged from the shadows. He knew. The camp had ears. $5,000, Dasan said. He did not sound angry. He sounded resigned. "That is many horses, many blankets." "It is safe," Lila said quietly. "It is a life where no one shoots at me, where I do not have to worry about water rights or winter storms." "Then you should take it," Dasan said. Lila looked up at him, shocked. "You want me to go?" Dasan sat across from her. He poked the fire with a stick, sending sparks swirling into the darkness. "I want you to be happy," he said. "Here, life is hard. The winter will be cold. The army may return one day. Briggs is dead, but there are other men like him. Boston is safe." "Is that what you think I want?" Lila asked, her voice rising. "Safety. I think you have fought enough," Dasan said. He looked at her then, and the raw vulnerability in his eyes took her breath away. "You were trapped, Lila, by your father's debt, by Briggs, by the iron. I cut the iron, but if I ask you to stay, I'm just another trap. I'm just another cage." He reached out and touched her hand. His skin was warm against hers. "Your legs are free now," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You choose where they stand. If they stand in Boston, I will not stop them. I will watch the sun set and know you are warm. Lila looked at the contract. She looked at the man who would rather let her go than hold her back. She remembered the feeling of the silk dresses she used to wear. She remembered the smell of the library in the city. Then she remembered the smell of sage and wood smoke in the cave. She remembered the weight of Dasan's body protecting her from the storm. She remembered the feeling of the gun in her hand, not the violence, but the power of choosing her own fate. Boston is a long way away, she whispered. It is, Dasan agreed. Lila looked at the fire. Mr. Finch wants a story about a victim, about a girl who was saved. He does not want the truth. And what is the truth? Dasan asked. Lila stood up. She took the contract and held it over the flames. The paper curled, turned brown, and then caught fire. She watched it burn until it was nothing but black ash floating on the wind. The truth, Lila said, turning to Dasan, is that the girl died in the trap. The woman who walked out belongs to the canyon. Dasan stood up slowly. He looked at the ash, then at her. A light came into his face, a dawn breaking after a long night. The canyon is hard, he warned. I am harder, Lila replied. She stepped closer to him. The space between them, which had been filled with doubt and cultural divides, suddenly felt very small. I am not staying in the canyon, Dasan, she said softly. I am staying for the warrior who taught me how to breathe. Dasan did not speak. He closed the distance. He wrapped his good arm around her waist and pulled her against him. He buried his face in her hair, breathing her in as if she were the air itself. Then stand here, he whispered into her ear. Stand with me. The next morning, Mr. Alistair Finch waited by his carriage in Dustfall. He checked his gold pocket watch. Noon came and went. Lila McKenna did not appear. Finch shook his head, muttering about the foolishness of women, and signaled his driver to leave. As the carriage rolled away, leaving a cloud of dust, he did not look up at the distant ridge. If he had, he would have seen two figures on horseback, silhouetted against the vast blue sky. Lila sat on her mare, watching the carriage disappear. She felt a lightness in her chest that she had never known. She turned her horse away from the town, away from the railroad, and toward the jagged mouth of Throat Canyon. She was not going back to her father's ranch. That was a house of ghosts. She and Dasan rode to a high mesa that overlooked the junction of the two worlds. There, among the juniper trees and the ancient stones, stood the shell of a small cabin. It was not built of milled lumber from the company store. It was built of stone and hand-hewn logs. It was unfinished. The roof needed thatch. The windows needed shutters. It needs work, Dasan said, looking at the structure. We have time, Lila said. She slid off her horse, her boots hitting the ground with a solid thud. She walked to the edge of the mesa. Below, the river wound like a silver ribbon. To the south lay the Apache lands. To the north, the town. And here, in the middle, the wind blew clean and strong. Lila felt the scars on her legs tingle, a reminder of the pain that had brought her here. She did not try to hide them. She lifted her face to the sun. She had lost her parents. She had lost her status. She had lost the comfort of the known world. But as Dasan came to stand beside her, his hand finding hers, she knew she had found something rare. She had found a place where she did not have to close her legs or her heart. She had found a place where she could stand tall. Winter is coming, Dasan said, looking at the clouds gathering on the northern peaks. Let it come, Lila said, squeezing his hand. We have fire. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the desert floor. The falling action of the great drama was over. The shouting was done. Now, there was only the quiet work of living, and the promise of a story that was finally, truly, their own. The winter snows had melted from the high passes, feeding the streams that trickled down through the red rocks of Throat Canyon. The world was waking up, stretching its limbs after a long slumber, and high on a stone shelf overlooking the valley, a new structure had risen to greet the sun. It was not a cabin in the way the timbermen of the North built them, nor was it a wickiup of the Apache plains. It was something in between, a marriage of stone and wood born of two different worlds. The foundation was native rock, stacked dry and tight in the way of the ancient ones who had lived in these cliffs 1,000 years ago. But the walls were sturdy pine logs, notched and fitted with the precision of a craftsman, and the roof was pitched to shed the heavy snows of the high desert. Inside, the air smelled of cedar shavings and drying sage. There was no iron stove imported from St. Louis. Instead, a central fire pit, lined with flat river stones, provided heat and a place to cook, the smoke rising through a cleverly constructed vent in the roof. But along the back wall, sitting on shelves hewn from rough oak, were rows of books. Shakespeare, the Bible, a primer on arithmetic, and a tattered collection of poetry remnants of a schoolhouse that no longer existed, saved from the wreckage of Lila McKenna's old life. On the floor, near the fire, lay a collection of small wooden figures. There was a horse, a coyote, and a clumsy-looking bear. Dasan had carved them during the long winter nights, his obsidian knife moving with patience and care, shaping the wood for the children who now ran freely between the hidden camp and this stone perch. Lila sat at a small table near the window. The glass for the pane had been a trade item, bartered for with piles of winter furs, and it was the one luxury she had insisted upon. Through it, she could see the valley floor, the green ribbon of the river, and the distant, hazy smudge that was the town of Dustfall. She dipped her pen into the inkwell. Her fingers were stained with black, a mark of her trade just as the calluses on Dasan's hands were marks of his. She was writing, not a ledger of debts, not a list of supplies for a mining company, but a story. To the editor of the New York Herald, she wrote, her handwriting looping and firm. You ask for tales of the savage West. You ask for blood and thunder. But I will tell you today of a woman who lost a child to fever, and a man who lost a wife to a soldier's bullet, and how they stood together to plant corn in soil that was supposed to be barren. She paused, looking out the window. The East wanted monsters. They wanted Dasan to be a bloodthirsty ghost, and they wanted her to be the damsel in distress or the tragic victim. They did not want to hear that the savage spent 3 hours yesterday fixing a leak in the roof of the Widow Higgins' barn in town, simply because she had no one else to ask. They did not want to hear that the civilized banker in Dustfall was currently charging 40% interest on seed loans. Lila returned to the page. The West is not a stage for your morality plays, she continued. It is a place where the wind does not care about your politics, and the only thing that separates a man from the grave is the kindness of a stranger he has been taught to hate. The door opened, letting in a gust of crisp spring air. Dasan entered. He carried a brace of jackrabbits over his shoulder, their fur turning from winter white to the mottled brown of the brush. He wore a new shirt made of blue calico, a gift from the town seamstress tucked into his buckskin leggings. The contrast made Lila smile. He was walking between worlds, just as she was. He saw her smiling and raised an eyebrow. The movement was small, but she knew every line of his face now. She knew that a lifted eyebrow meant amusement, and a tightening of the jaw meant worry. You smile at the paper, Dasan said, hanging the rabbits on a hook near the door. Does the paper tell a joke? I smile at the lie I am correcting, Lila said. She put down her pen. Mr. Finch, that publisher from Boston, sent a clipping. It says I am living in squalor, held captive by my Stockholm Syndrome. Dasan walked over to the water basin and washed his hands. Stockholm Syndrome, is that a sickness of the lungs? It is a sickness of the mind, Lila explained, standing up and stretching her back. It means I love my captor because I am too weak to run away. Dasan dried his hands and turned to her. He crossed the room in 3 strides. He did not touch her immediately. He stood close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him, smelling of pine resin and the wild wind. The door has no lock, he said softly. I know, Lila replied. The horses are saddled. I know. Then let them write what they want, Dasan said. The paper burns. The stone stays. He did not offer flowery declarations of love. He did not recite poetry. But that morning, he had risen before dawn to chop wood so the house would be warm when she woke. Yesterday, he had spent hours tracking a lost calf for a rancher who used to spit on him, just to keep the peace for Lila's sake. Lila reached out and took his hand. It was rough, scarred, and strong. "Bring the wood in. Husband," she said, using the word not as a legal title, but as a statement of fact. "The children are coming for their lessons soon." The lessons took place outside, on a flat stretch of rock that served as a slate. 7 children sat in a semicircle. 3 were from the Apache camp, with hair black as raven wings. 4 were from the town, the children of miners and farmers who had slowly, tentatively, begun to trust the woman on the ridge. Lila held up a piece of charcoal. She drew a jagged line. "Mountain," she said in English. Then she looked at the oldest Apache boy, a quick-witted youth named Taza. "Zili," she said, attempting the guttural, flowing sound of his language. The children laughed at her accent, but it was a kind laugh. "Zili," Taza corrected her, shaping the sound with the ease of birthright. "Zili," the white children repeated, their tongues tripping over the new sounds. Dasan sat nearby, whittling a new latch for the gate. He watched the scene with eyes that missed nothing. A year ago, these children would have been taught to shoot each other on sight. Now, they were trading words. It was a small thing, a fragile thing. But an acorn is small, and it grows into the oak that splits the stone. Later that afternoon, after the children had gone home scampering down the trails like mountain goats, the sun began to dip behind the western peaks. The air grew cold quickly, the high desert dropping its temperature as soon as the light failed. They ate a stew of rabbit and wild onions, sitting on the rug before the fire. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the crackle of burning juniper. Lila stared into the flames. Her mind drifted back, pulled by the undertow of memory to a darker place. She saw the narrow canyon. She felt the cold shade. She heard the metallic snap of the trap. A shiver ran through her, involuntary and sharp. She drew her knees up to her chest. Dasan saw it. He set his bowl down. He did not ask what was wrong. He knew the ghosts that walked in the firelight. He moved behind her, wrapping his arms around her shoulders, pulling her back against his chest. His chin rested on the top of her head. "The iron is gone," he whispered into her hair. "I know," Lila said, her voice trembling slightly. "But sometimes I can still feel the teeth. I think, what if you had not heard me? What if the wind had blown the other way? I would have died there. Dasan, I would have died screaming in the dirt." Dasan tightened his hold. "You did not die. You fought. You held the gun." "I was helpless," Lila insisted. "I could not move." Dasan turned her in his arms so she faced him. The firelight danced on his face, highlighting the scar on his cheek and the deep, dark pools of his eyes. "Listen to me," he said, his voice fierce and low. "You think the trap defined you. You think the iron made you weak. No, the iron only revealed what was already there. It revealed that you could endure pain that would kill a horse. It revealed that you would not beg." He reached down and touched her legs, his hands resting gently over the faded scars beneath her skirt. "Your legs brought you here," he said, "not their iron. You walked out of that canyon. You climbed the mountain. You rode into the battle. Do not give the credit to the trap. Give the credit to the legs that stood up." Lila looked at him, tears pricking her eyes. He had a way of cutting through her self-doubt like a knife through canvas. He refused to let her be a victim. "You carried me," she whispered. "For a mile," Dasan admitted. "You have walked the rest of the way yourself." He leaned in. The kiss was slow, tasting of wood smoke and rabbit stew. It was not the desperate, frantic kissing of 2 people trying to forget the world. It was the kiss of 2 people who had built a world worth remembering. It was a claim. It was an anchor. Lila closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of the fire and the warmth of the man. She was safe, not because she was hidden, but because she was known. Sunday morning brought a sound that stopped Lila in her tracks. She was outside, hanging washed linens on a line stretched between two pines. The air was still and crisp. From the valley floor, miles away in dustfall, the church bell began to ring. Clang, clang, clang. It was a clear, brassy sound, calling the faithful to the white-clapboard chapel that had been built on the ashes of the first saloon. Then, from the south, from the deep ravine where the main Apache camp lay hidden, another sound rose. Thrum, thrum, thrum. It was the beat of the ceremonial drum. The people were celebrating the changing woman ceremony for a girl coming of age. Lila stood still, a wet shirt in her hand. She waited for the sounds to clash. She waited for the discord, for the noise of one culture to drown out the other. But the wind carried them both, the high metallic ring of the bell and the deep, earthen heartbeat of the drum. They wove together in the air above Throat Canyon. They did not fight. They harmonized, a strange, syncopated rhythm that sounded like the heartbeat of the land itself. Dasan came up beside her. He listened for a long moment. "They are loud today," he noted. "They are speaking to each other," Lila said. "Even if they do not know it. Maybe," Dasan said. "Or maybe they are just shouting at the sky. But at least they are not shooting." Lila laughed. She pinned the shirt to the line. "I will take not shooting. It is a good start." It was a lesson she had learned in the hardest way possible. Freedom was not a piece of paper signed by a colonel or a president. Freedom was not a deed to a ranch. Freedom was the ability to stand on your own 2 feet, scars and all, and choose where to walk. Briggs was dead, buried under the rock he had tried to weaponize. But Lila knew there were other Briggs in the world. There were men in boardrooms in Chicago and politicians in Washington who looked at the map and saw only profit. The war was not over. It would never truly be over. Greed was a weed that grew back every spring. But here, on this ridge, there was a fire that would not go out. Lila looked at the satchel hanging by the door, the same satchel that had once carried the death warrant for the Apache. Now, it holds seeds, corn seeds, squash seeds, bean seeds. "We plant tomorrow," Lila said. "The ground is ready." Dasan replied. 6 months later, a newspaper arrived from the east. It had been carried by train, then by stagecoach, and finally brought up the trail by the young livery hand. "Thomas." Lila unfolded it on the table. The headline screamed in bold, black type, "The Captive Bride of the Canyon, How a Schoolteacher Was Stolen by Red Devils and Forced into Savagery." The article was filled with lurid details. It spoke of chains, of torture, of a woman mind broken into subservience. It described Dasan as a towering brute with eyes like burning coals. Lila read it aloud. Dasan listened, whittling a piece of cedar. When she finished, there was silence. Then, Lila started to laugh. It started as a chuckle and grew into a full, belly-shaking laugh that brought tears to her eyes. "Red devils," she gasped. "Forced into savagery." Dasan looked at his carving, a delicate bird with wings spread wide. He looked at the bookshelf. He looked at the woman who had taught him how to read the fine print of a contract, and who now wore moccasins as if she had been born in them. "They have a good imagination," Dasan said dryly. "They have fear," Lila corrected, wiping her eyes. "They write what they are afraid of. They are afraid that we might be happy. They are afraid that a white woman could look at an Apache and see a man, not a monster. Because if that is true, then everything they are doing to your people is a crime." She grabbed her pen. She pulled a fresh sheet of paper. "What are you doing?" Dasan asked. "I am writing a correction," Lila said, her eyes flashing with the same fire that had faced down Silas Briggs. "I am going to tell them the truth. I was not captured. Dasan, I was rescued. And I was not forced into savagery. I was invited into humanity." She began to write. The scratch of the pen was loud in the quiet house. "To the editor," she began, "You call me a captive. I tell you, I have never been more free." And so, the story goes, not the way the dime novels printed it, but the way the wind remembers it. The West was not tamed by guns alone, nor was it built solely on the backs of iron horses. It was stitched together by the unlikely threads of connection between people who had every reason to kill one another. There are places in this world where the land has been twisted by greed, where men try to close the throat of the earth to choke out a profit. And there are people who walk through life with their legs bound by the invisible traps of fear and prejudice, unable to move, unable to love. But sometimes, in the high desert, where the air is thin and the light is clear, a trap snaps shut and breaks a life open instead of ending it. Sometimes, a lone warrior looks down from a cliff and sees not an enemy, but a soul in pain. And sometimes, a woman with a ledger full of debts realizes that the only currency that matters is courage. Lila McKenna and Dasan did not change the whole world. The railroad eventually came, the fences went up, the old ways faded like smoke in the wind. But on that ridge, overlooking Throat Canyon, they kept a fire burning. They stood barefoot on the warm stone, watching the sun rise over a land that was scarred. Yes, but healing. And they did not look back at the sunset of what was lost. They looked forward to the day that was coming. For in the end, love is not just looking at each other. It is standing together and looking in the same direction. Thank you so much for listening to this story. It has been a long journey from the dusty office of Silas Briggs to the quiet peace of the cabin on the ridge. I hope Lila and Dasan's story touched something in you. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below and tell me where you are listening to this story from. Are you in a busy city? Or somewhere quiet like Throat Canyon? What did you think of Lila's choice? If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales. Hit that like button to help keep the fire burning. And if you really want to support the channel and help these stories reach more people, please press the hype button. Your support means the world to this old writer. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your heart open.